Going. Good afternoon, everybody, and I applaud you on your ability to stick with us. It's a long day, but I'm convinced that you will find this panel has been worth the wait. The title of this panel, as you see, is Prayer as a Prod to Social Justice Work. When we think about this, why have this in this type of conference, in a conference devoted to prayer? Why put something here on social justice? Well, you know, on a very technical level, of course, synagogue is the major locus of prayer, and it's also a very significant structure in which social justice is encouraged and performed. So the question is, how do those two pieces relate to each other? But I think there are other ways of looking at it, you know, from a philosophical standpoint. One of the things that in my own development was very meaningful was when I read in Judaism as a Civilization by Mordechai Caplan, where he wrote that the worship of God can somehow never be in the right tone if it doesn't lead you to work towards the improvement, I'll say, of humanity. He said of mankind, but we'll say it otherwise. And of course, one of the most probably often quoted comments, of the second half of the 20th century was Abraham Joshua Heschel's statement that in participating in the civil rights marches, he felt that his feet were praying. It's a very, I think, complex idea that, as many complex ideas, sometimes get simplified and we just enjoy the poetry of it. But those are that's the type of context that I think informs this particular conversation. In all of the sessions, we haven't had the time to introduce each person because the biographies are so rich, and we're trying to give the people as much time to speak as possible. But I really, really very strongly encourage you to look at the biographies of the group of rabbis that we have here in front of us, because in my view, when it comes to the whole question of prayer and social justice, we've really assembled a dream team, as it were, and we're bringing to you, I think, people who embody a lot of some of the most intelligent and profound practice in this particular regard. The way we're structuring the session is each person will speak for approximately 7 minutes on how they view and experience the relationship of prayer to social justice. We'll have a bit of back and forth amongst us based on what is heard up here. And then, as was the tradition in all of the other sessions, we will be looking at the questions that have come up. And so when after the first person has spoken, you can already start to raise your hands, and you'll be given a card on which to write the questions that you have. So we're going to start off just in the random order in which people sat down, and our first speaker is Rabbi Shawn Zevit.
Can I walk down here? Is that okay? And then you can just say 1 minute when it's that time, just from behind me there. Is that okay in terms of Will you lose me? Okay. You all right back there? All right, we're good. Thank you. I've just been feeling the gap all day, that everybody's been so far away. So for the sake of tikkun of our world, I felt it was a moment to step in and be a little bit more in relationship, which has a lot to do with what I want to say about prayer and social justice. So don't be shy, you can, when we're getting close to landing time, okay? So I want to start with a prayer. What of prayer and social justice? Is not this the beginning and end of prayer? To love each other and the planet of which we are a part, to inspire and ignite within us the very sense of communal responsibility, that our prayers become activist stances, connecting us to our own hearts and our values, to those in our immediate communities, and ultimately, as all worship ends in Aleinu, it is upon us, letakeno olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair the world, for godliness to permeate everywhere. Love is an action, not just a feeling, our tradition teaches us. And we pray for justice to enter our hearts. The Jewish path in prayer and justice is both reflexive and externally active. Our word for prayer is tefillah, from the ancient word Hebrew palal, to judge or discern. The prefix directs us to meet the internal judge and pour our hearts and actions towards inwards and outwards from a place of greater clarity and equanimity. Are not the judges those we look to for dispensation and discernment of justice? Are not these the people we would want to judge us the same way? Holy One of blessing, your invitation is to locate our acts of tikkun in honesty, in equity, in love for each other and this planet. For without prayer in the acts of justice, we may start to believe we are alone the source and judge of what is a right course of action. Without taking our prayers out of the sanctuary in the streets, we seek risking ourselves seeking comfort and escape from the cries around us. All of the natural world has its own song to the universe. When we lovingly open our hearts, when we strive for justice within and outside the walls of our communities, then we can become the prayer, a grounding source for the ideas of justice and grounding force for the actions of justice. Amen. So that's the prayer, and the rest will be commentary now. So I'll pick up, I got nervous, Eric, because I thought he's going to take all my Caplan quotes, but you left me one behind. I scratched a couple off. And the one that you left me was from Random Thoughts, one of my bumper stickers when it comes to prayer and ideas of God and justice. Caplan writes in Random Thoughts, "A theology which is not a plan of social action is merely a way of preaching and praying. It is a menu without serving the dinner." So for me, that's a deep aspect of that I would, if I was rewriting the title, I might say, what of social justice in prayer and prayer in social justice, to not create a false dichotomy, because I don't think that's the historic Jewish way. In fact, understanding that since the 1960s, we sought a term to consolidate our ideas of justice, and tikkun olam was readily available. Part of the issue of that, and where I think prayer is so important, is the historic and the deep, both historic and mystical idea of tikkun, is hanefesh ve'olam, is the repair and rebalancing of the soul and the world simultaneously. So that by creating this category called tikkun olam, social justice, we unmoored it from the meta category of tikkun, which encompassed prayer, spiritual practice, acts of justice, loving kindness, rebalancing the world, internal, external, in a dichotomy. And knowing that just like prayer in our life, we're going to go through different times and different periods where we'll be more out on the streets, or we'll be more serving in the soup kitchen, or we'll be more sitting in quiet, in silence and meditation, visiting a loved one in a hospital, taking care of one of our eldering parents. This is all tikkun from the Jewish perspective. I remember once doing a program in a large Reform synagogue, very committed to social justice in Philadelphia, and they wanted to daven and discuss this very question within the service, so there wasn't a split that way. And I went around and I asked people to say, where's a moment recently where you feel you've really done something to change the world? And people were rattling off this and that, and at the end of it I said, everyone, we're going to say v'nomar amen. So we're going to pray your responses, as opposed to say, and now for something completely different. And we got to one woman in the room who started to cry, and she said, I was the co-chair of the Tikkun Olam committee here, and I'm hearing everybody else's great actions, and I left activity in the synagogue to support my partner to create a business and raise my 3 children, and I feel bereft hearing all the good works that everybody is doing, like I'm failing the world and the Jewish people. And there was this big silence, and jaws dropped, and people said, are you kidding? My marriage ended. My kids are so messed up. If I had committed like what you did for this, and everybody else admired and realized there was a vacuum in their life because they were out organizing the vote, trying to change policies around hunger, but they all felt that they, by virtue of that, had lost home and family and friendships as a cost of doing that work. And so that opened up that discussion, and where I think prayer, particularly tefillah, or let's call it avodah sometimes, sacred service, or even that word that most of us don't even use in the vernacular, tzloton, which if you're a yogini, right, you know, I've now, namaste, I've finished my practice. That's that in Kaddish Titkabel, at the end of our prayer service, we say, I hope these prayers are lifted up because I have finished my practice. Right? That's something I'm obligated. It's part of my stance in the world, my vitamology of prayer. So I think the words we use for prayer are as equally as important as the ways we locate that. So I'm going to move ahead, but there's so many wonderful quotes in the packet that Eric gave us ahead of time, from Caplan, from Heschel. I love the one from Rebecca Albert, where she talks about how by virtue of bringing prayer, on Shabbat morning, she used to be a group of women who would stand and protect an abortion clinic that did abortions on Saturday morning. And there was an evangelical Christian group that would show up at the same time. And by virtue of that, the scene shifted from violent confrontation to tolerable difference only when they started to pray on site. And Rebecca herself said, wait a minute, I'm missing Shabbos. I'm in this dichotomy of these two. And when she started, that group started to pray, and the other group started to pray at the same time, a mutual respect arose that they were not, in Kabbalistic terms, breaking the vessels in order to repair the world. Right? Part of my theory of prayer and justice, if you're on the way to Save the Whales March and you run over the squirrel, you pull over and you say Kaddish, and maybe you don't make it to the Save the Whales march, because you've actually harmed a life on the way to save a life, which our tradition holds as well. So, and I love what you also wrote, Jill, in some of your book, in your beautiful book about social justice, about being careful that prayer and spiritual practice also can modify us thinking that we're suddenly at the center of the universe and we're so much more evolved because we're one of the tomato rabbis, or we're doing some action and we're so much more elevated now than the people who are not anymore. There's a leveling and a humanizing factor that prayer can also have an aspect and an important contribution to. So I'm trying to think, finish with some examples in my own life that way. I worked for the Reconstructionist movement for 14 years in doing congregational services and Tikkun Olam. It always puzzled me that one of the most often requests for consultation was from congregations for whom the Tikkun Olam committee was at odds with the rest of the congregation. You don't get it, you don't understand sustainability, you're all idiots. The board was like, oh, here the green police are coming again. And I thought, now why am I being invited into a higher percentage of those conflict resolutions with the people who are doing justice and the rest of the congregation than other aspects? And part of that was prayer and the idea of harmonizing that hanefesh ve'olam, the respect of the individual soul as well as the attempt to repair the world, were out of balance. And that's an important place and a role I think prayer has, because it presents us with a spiritual audit, with that moment for us to reflect on how we are being in our doing, and not just doing, our being that way. And so we at Mishkan Shalom, where I've now been the rabbi for a little less than 2 years, we have prayer at every board meeting, but I don't lead all those prayers. It rotates. Each board member, whether they consider themselves a prayer or not, or spiritual or not, has that 5-minute option, and it rotates, and one person chooses the next person the next month, so that there's an element of we all have to own this, that this isn't just the rabbi or the minyan that's doing the praying for us or the spiritual practice. Right? We do the same thing in our Tikkun Olam work as well. And I've noticed by reviving prayer in the last 2 years, and I have a highly activist congregation. In fact, most folks don't do Tikkun Olam work through our synagogue because they're so involved with their work as judge, as immigration lawyers, whatever, that doing it again in the synagogue would seem like a stretch. But the prayer life had also atrophied. And by reviving soulful, meaningful, musical prayer, I've noticed that the majority of folks now comprising where we would have gotten 10 or 12 people, now the 20 to 40 on a Friday night, are in fact the activists who are coming to renew their soul and to come on Shabbos to let go the frontline battle they've been doing all week. And that by having a solid prayer practice, they're going out more into the world. And we now have more people involved in Tikkun Olam activities in the synagogue, from children to elders, than we had before, since we started a prayer revival as well. Very important piece to not separate these ideas. And so there's all these aspects within one's own congregation. In fact, some of the people who I invite people, if they've written prayers, poems, if they have a new tune, they can walk in that Friday night and say, I've got something, and I'm going to find a spot for them spontaneously in there. And half of all those people are the activists that are now writing poems and prayers that they're bringing into their activities, that they know they have a home in the synagogue in prayer and in worship to be able to offer those aspects. Community organizing work, congregational-based community organizing work, which is interfaith social justice work, prayer is of a primacy there. And, you know, to do that act and to be in an interfaith place, again, the prayer is what gives us, even if we use different modalities, a common language, even though we may not agree on all the justice issues that we share. But that prayerful process. And I was asked to, the executive director of our POWER, our Philadelphia-based interfaith organizing initiative, to come to have a conversation with the leading Baptist pastor, the largest suburban Baptist congregation. And I was there as the quiet presence. And we all arrived in the meeting just this last week. And I didn't expect to say anything. We sat down and the pastor immediately said, Rabbi, please offer us the opening prayer. And I just dipped in, and there's that moment where if I didn't have my own prayer practice, the legitimacy of us being in the room would have been undermined. By the end of the meeting, he was talking about committing a budget, and he had allocated one of his ministers to help become part of our organizing initiative. That was a testing moment. If I showed up just as the Tikkun Olam person, but could not, I'm not saying what God language was used or not, but if I couldn't access a place where I could dip in and convene us and have a sense of the prayerful moment, that relationship may not have moved forward. Right? So I think each of us has to find these places, especially when we get into interfaith social justice work. This last Pesach for me was a moment, a deep moment of challenge in my own life, because it was the anniversary of King's assassination, it was Easter weekend, and it was Pesach. And so in Philadelphia, in alliance with what was going on in Baltimore, there was a lot of activity, and there was a convening as well of a march on that day. And I wrestled inside because I've never left my home or the synagogue on Pesach. And yet none of the other Jewish leaders were going to go on this rally. And I could feel the sense of our brothers and sisters of color going, are they really with us or only when it works for them? And so I was transparent with my board and with my congregation, who fully supported my leading the service. We chanted Hallel. A few of us hit the streets. Right? I ended up on a truck, you know, not knowing again I was going to speak when Reverend Mark Tyler said, and now words on Passover and the meaning of justice with Rabbi Shawn Zevit. So suddenly I'm on the downtown streets, and again having to just pray it out, brothers and sisters, and then back to host our family Seder that night. I have to say I've never felt the meaning of Pesach more deeply. And I was quite clear, I'm not creating a precedent. This is not, you know, where are you going next, Pesach, Rabbi? You know, that's not the precedent, but it was the moment calling. And I felt by connecting to prayer in the morning, by being transparent about it and weaving in, that people davened more powerfully that morning, knowing that activity was going to happen, that it was a balance, and that they didn't all have to be there, but they were in the conversation. So last, I must speak at time, okay. So lastly, I want to say how to also bring social justice into our prayer. It's an important piece that the room outside of our sanctuary is the Heschel King room, which has a big photo dedicated to Rabbi Brian Walt, the founder of our congregation, with Heschel and King marching. So when Ali Abu Awad, who's a leading nonviolent peace activist for the Palestinian people, arrived at our synagogue to speak last spring and walked in, he started crying before he got to the sanctuary. And he said, "This is the first time I've seen in a synagogue these pictures and the words of these people up by a place of prayer. In all the synagogues I had visited, I know I'm at home." And it shifted his conversation and his feeling of safety in this Jewish community, because those icons, those words of justice were in the prayer space, not relegated to something outside that. So that's just something for us to consider, is how we bring in the elements, the visuals, the aesthetics of justice into our prayer, not only prayer into social justice. Oh, thank you.
Down there. I also don't want to be so far away. Thank you, Shawn. It was a great introduction to what I want to say. I'm Rabbi Jill Jacobs. I'm the executive director of Trua, which is an organization that mobilizes rabbis in our communities around human rights. And Shawn really started where I want to go, which is in breaking down the dichotomy between prayer and justice work. We often have situations where in a synagogue you have the people who are there Shabbat morning and you have the people who are there Sunday afternoon. And often it's very different people, because we have this idea that what happens in the synagogue on Shabbat morning doesn't have anything to do with the justice work that might be happening on Sunday afternoon or another time during the week. But in fact, they're all, I believe, part of an integrated whole. And I want to talk about that through 4 categories. So the first is that our prayer, the very words of our liturgy, are supposed to spur us to justice. I could have pulled any number of lines out of our liturgy that talk about the justice that God does in the world. So whether we look at Birkot HaShachar and all of the different blessings that we give to God, whether it's for making us free, whether it's for clothing the naked, for opening the eyes of the blind, for providing all of our needs. We have lines that we say also every morning from Psalm 146 about God, that God is the one who oseh mishpat lashukim noten lechem l're'evim. God is the one who does justice for those who are oppressed, who gives bread to those who are hungry. That God in the Shabbat liturgy is the one who is matzil ani michazak mimenu, the one who rescues, who saves the poor person from the one who's stronger than he is, and on and on and on. And these lines are not meant to just tell us, oh, God is so great, so we can just sit back and give praise, but in fact, they're supposed to push us out of the synagogue, that if we're actually partners with God, if part of what we're supposed to do as Jews is to imitate God, then we need to take these lines and act as God acts, and not just sit back and say, oh, it's so great, you're taking care of everything, you're freeing those who are enslaved, you're clothing the naked, et cetera, et cetera. It's for us to participate. So that's the first thing that prayer does, is it pushes us to follow God in taking actions toward justice. Second, this is actually a lot of what Shawn talked about. Prayer is also provides comfort. This is in some ways the corollary, the reverse to what I just said, that for those of us who are involved in justice work during the week, prayer is a time that we can come to the synagogue and find strength from the community and from the words of the prayer. Of course, I have to quote Caplan, so I'll just give you one line that he says, when we come to the synagogue after having tried our utmost to deal fairly with our neighbor, to suppress our evil impulses, and have made an effort to meet our responsibilities as human beings, then worship can yield its measure of spiritual strength and give us a sense of inward peace. So it is a time not only to be pushed outward, but also to be able to gather the strength that we're going to need to be able to do that work the next day. The third category, which Shawn also referred to, that I wrote about in one of my books, is that prayer also gives us a sense of humility. It's very easy for those of us who do justice work to think that we're going to save the world. This is especially true when people first start out. I certainly felt like this when I was 23 or 24. If I just can work 24 hours a day, then we're going to win this campaign and we're going to save everything and we're going to change this law. And ultimately, of course, we realize that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And in fact, we hope that we'll leave the world a little more just than we found it, but we're not going to get to the perfected world in our lifetimes. Maybe in our grandchildren, great-grandchildren's lifetimes, we'll get there. And the fact, the very lines that I mentioned and more that push us outward also remind us that we don't do it ourselves. We give God praise for God's action in the world, and that reminds us that yes, we have to participate with God, we have to partner with God, and at the same time, it's not enough for us to go out and just try to do justice work ourselves, but we have to really believe that God is standing there with us, that we're relying on that divine help because we can't do it alone. So it pushes us to a place of humility. And the fourth way that justice work, social justice, and prayer come together is in some of the ways that our prayers and our justice work can add meaning to each other, can be integrated together. In Judaism, traditionally, there aren't brachot that we say for ethical commandments. It's a little bit surprising because we have brachot that we say for anything that we eat, for lighting Shabbat candles, for most of the actions that we do that are commanded. And yet we have a whole world of commanded actions that are ethical actions that we don't have brachot for. There are a few classical explanations for this. One is that when we're talking about tzedakah, when we're talking about things having to do with poverty, there's some degradation involved. The person who's asking for tzedakah might feel bad about it. There's a sense that that person there's a degradation associated with that person asking. And so we might not say a bracha, a blessing, where there's a sense of degradation. The second explanation that's traditionally given is that we say a bracha when we're about to discharge an obligation. So we say the bracha for Shabbat candles, we light the Shabbat candles, done. Check it off. Well, you can't check it off the list, but mentally check it off the list. Or you say a bracha not for a mitzvah, but for something you eat, you're about to eat it. But whereas with tzedakah or any other kind of ethical commandments, we're never done. You can't say, I said the bracha, I did the thing, I'm done. And so we can't say the bracha for that reason. And then the third reason, which comes from a 14th century Spanish commentator, Abu Draham, he says that in the case of tzedakah, the recipient, you're depending on the recipient actually accepting your tzedakah. So you can't say the bracha assuming that your mitzvah is going to be done, because you're always waiting for the person to actually accept it, which they have the discretion to say that they won't. So classically, we don't have brachot that we say for ethical commandments. There are some in the Reform movement. There are a few brachot that have been written in the Reconstructionist movement. There's at least one bracha that I know of that's been written for giving tzedakah. But these are our modern liturgy. So classically, we don't have brachot. But there are certainly ways to integrate our liturgy into doing justice action. I'll give just a couple of examples. A year or two ago, I was speaking at a conference on modern-day slavery that was happening at UJ. So we had different people who are activists or rabbis who are coming together to talk about how the Jewish community can get involved in modern-day slavery. It's an issue that my organization has been working on for about 5 or 6 years. And I decided to start out by having everybody say the line from Birkot HaShachar in which we thank God for making us free, for not making us slaves. In my version, it's for making us free. Some people have a version of for not making us slaves. And it was a way to say that actually what we were doing there was holy work. I wasn't going to create a new bracha to say on the conference or on the conversation, but I wanted to say, here's a bracha that we say every morning anyway. Maybe some of us already did that morning, maybe some of us didn't, but let's say it as our intention for what we're doing today. The second example, Shawn also referred to it just in passing, that for the last, I think 4 years, Trua has been taking rabbis down to the Florida tomato fields to meet with the workers there. The Florida tomato fields 4 years ago were considered ground zero for modern-day slavery in the United States, and at the time, an estimated 10% of the workers were in slavery. Today, because of some changes that I'll mention now, there hasn't been a new case of slavery found in the last year. So it's gone from being the worst place in American agriculture to one of the best. And we went down there for the first time in September of 2011, and we met with some of the workers from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is the organization of tomato workers who have been working for the past 15 or so years to change conditions in the fields. And then we were told before we came down there, there's one of the growers, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers said, the grower who's our closest partner, the first one who signed what's called a fair food agreement with us, is flying out from LA. He wants to host you for dinner at his farm, and he's bringing his rabbi with him. So we had no idea what was going to happen. We go over to the farm. It's Pacific Tomato Growers, which is one of the 6 biggest tomato companies in the US. If you ever see those little grape tomatoes, the sun-ripe grape tomatoes, you can get them all over. That's the brand. So we go over, we're 17 rabbis. This guy, Jonas Forms, who's the managing partner of Pacific Tomato Growers, shows up. He's got his rabbi with him from LA. And the story he tells is that the previous year, after doing a lot of thinking about his family and his family's history, it was a family-owned business, Jewish business, starting on the Lower East Side back in the day, and now one of the biggest tomato growing businesses. there was one of the worst cases of slavery was found in that farm in 2009, and he just started doing a lot of thinking about his family's values. And he ended up calling the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who he had never spoken to before, and he called them a couple weeks before, it was in September 2010, a couple weeks before Rosh Hashanah, and he said, I need to sign an agreement with you, and I need to do it before Yom Kippur. And he did it. The afternoon before Yom Kippur, they signed an agreement, and he pointed to this tree where they had signed this agreement, and there he spoke about, he quoted Heschel, he said, few are guilty, but all are responsible, and he said, my family has been guilty, we're now taking responsibility. And he talked about tshuva. And of course, I at some point turned to one of the representatives of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and said, is this guy for real? And he said, not only is he for real, but he's getting death threats from the other tomato growers because of what he did. So this guy, I mean, I can't say enough about what an incredible tzaddik he is. And we said we had planned that at some point we were going to daven mincha. We weren't exactly sure when or where. We were going to maybe do it in the farm. And we said we have to do it under this tree where this press conference was the year before. So we davened mincha, and during the course of it, and we davened, it was a very traditional service. And but one of the things we did is we sang aloud the line, V'tein bracha al pnei adama, v'sabenu mituva, that we ask God to give blessing on this land and that we're going to be satisfied from the goodness of the land. And we passed around a tomato. And it was a moment of being able to connect what we were doing and hearing and learning in this very, very sacred space with the most traditional of liturgy. So very often there's an impulse to write new liturgy, and I support that. I personally come from a more traditional background. I'm a conservative rabbi, and I think that much of the liturgy actually is already in our texts, and we just have to find those lines that maybe don't get sung, or maybe we never noticed before, they don't get emphasized, and we're able to pull them out and connect them to the work that we're doing. So just to recap, the four categories in which I see this connection between prayer and justice: one is that our prayer, our liturgy, spurs us to justice. The second is that it gives us some comfort to pray together, especially in community. The third is that it instills humility, that we realize we can't do it alone. And the fourth is that we can and should integrate the justice work we do with prayer in such a way that is going to bring meaning to both of them. Thank you.
Yer koach to both of you. I'm going to rebel. I'm not going to go down there. I had our shul had a very high bima. We got rid of it a few years ago, many years ago. So it's nice, to be on a very high place once in a while. It's really nice. Remind of what we're missing. So I am not disagreeing at all with anything you said. On the contrary, I support and fully feel in the same spirit as the things that both Shawn and Jill said. I just want to maybe open up this conversation to a little bit of a different place, and of course landing in the same area of the things that you said. I think that when this panel was determined that this would be the conversation, of course it's based on the assumption that there is a dichotomy between prayer and justice. And I think we often also hear the dichotomy in our communities or in our people between those who are observant or those who daven and those who are activists. These people seem to often be in different camps. I think we're all trying we know that that's a false dichotomy, and we've all been working to bridge that gap and to affirm that these things are not contradictory. Then the other question is, are you doing work on yourself, or you're doing work on the world? Are you invested in your own spiritual work, nurturing your own spirituality, or are you invested more on the outside? Also another false dichotomy. I think we all recognize. So for me, the goal of prayer actually is the transformation of the human heart. The goal of prayer is not to fulfill God's need. I don't think that God needs us to pray. If God would need us to pray, then God would not be God. God would be incomplete and lacking. I think there's nothing lacking in God, and therefore that God doesn't need us to pray. I think that God wants us to pray for our sake, not for God's sake. And the goal of prayer is actually to be able to transform our heart. To transform our heart from a natural condition or state of being self-concerned, that everything, we start life as individuals, as children, as babies, as children, really with a great deal of need and of self-centeredness, and all of our needs have to be taken care. And as we grow into a state, hopefully, of understanding that we're here not to have our needs served, but to be able to serve others, and to shift our concern from a self-concern to an altruistic concern. And basically, I think that that's what God wants us to do when we pray, is to be able to shift our concern from ourselves to the other. And that since our teachers, Rabbi Akiva, said that the greatest principle in the Torah, the principle that includes all of the other principles in the Torah, is ve'afta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself, love the other as yourself. That's the mitzvah that contains all of the mitzvot, and if you will, the mitzvah to which all of the other mitzvot support or serve, including prayer. So the mitzvah of prayer is actually to serve ve'afta l'reacha kamocha, is in order to transform us so that we can love the other as we love ourselves. And so very difficult work, extremely difficult work, and that's why prayer is so demanding, and it cannot be something that done in a perfunctory way. We cannot engage in it, as Heschel calls it, in religious behaviorism, just recite the prayers externally. It has to be actually, a prayer has to accompany and to guide and to lead us to very serious, deep internal work in order to be able to transform our heart to a heart that loves, to a heart that wants to serve. And you see where I'm going in terms of the connection with social justice, that prayer ultimately is for the sake of enabling us to love the other, to love the world, to love what God loves, which is God's creation. There's no other way to be able to love God. God is not someone we can touch, but we can love that which God loves with all our heart. And so prayer is to be able to enable us to make that transformation, and to redefine ourselves, or to redirect ourselves, if you will. I think also prayer is there to remind us that we are in something that is called Zman Tikkun. Zman Tikkun is all the work that we have to do in order to get to the ultimate goal, which is Gemar Tikkun, which is the fulfillment of Tikkun. We are now, the Tikkun, the healing of the world exists now all in potential. And we have already tapped into some of this potential. We have progressively made changes in our world in order to be able to bring into reality, into actuality, some of that potential, but the potential still exists and is not been fully unfolded. It's not been actually fully realized. And so we are in this time of work of tikkun, called Zman Tikkun. And I think that prayer, the language of prayer, the activity of prayer, the effort of prayer, everything reminds us that we are still in Zman Tikkun, lest we believe that we have arrived. to the time of Gmar Tikkun, to the fulfillment of Tikkun, that we have not arrived. And so the prayer is a daily reminder, 3 times a day, that we are to keep working on ourselves, and the more we work on ourselves, the more we will work in our world, the more we will transform our heart, the more we will be able to transform our world. And that's actually what the struggle of spiritual life is about. I firmly believe that spiritual life has to be a struggle. It cannot be something that is a breeze. And it's something that is always comforting and always comfortable and always making me feel happy and making me feel good. I think part of spiritual life is to realize that we have to struggle. We have to struggle to get somewhere. We have to struggle in order to be able to transform ourselves. It's not something that comes easy or natural. And that we do it bit by bit, a little piece over a little piece. And so we get happy over something, over some achievement, and then we have to eventually find ourselves in a situation of lacking, in a situation of unhappiness, or a situation of disappointment, in order to move us to make the next change. And I think that prayer is a constant reminder of that lack, of that chisaron, of the gap. It's a reminder of the gap. You know, so many of us feel that prayer should be comforting, and I think in some way it is, but at the same time, that's part of the tension of prayer. Should be discomforting and comforting at the same time. And the discomforting aspect is to make us realize the work that we have to do. And if we don't feel the disappointment or we don't feel the discomfort, then how are we going to actually move in order to be able to fulfill what is missing, in order to bring and to fill the gap? So the discomfort is built into the prayer, and the disappointment and the sense of frustration. When we look at the word of the Siddur and we look at the world, we realize the gap between the words of the Siddur and the expressions of prayer. Sim shalom, tuva ubracha, chen v'chesed. All these things that we say, of course, we don't have full chesed, we don't have full chen, we don't have full bracha, we don't have full shalom. So we realize the gap, and the gap is what realization of the gap is what pushes us to make the next move. And so I think we come to the same place. I just wanted to open up a little bit of the mechanics of what is it that happens when we pray. God doesn't need our prayer. We need our prayer so that we can bring about a little bit more justice and love into our world.
Thank you. I'm Rabbi Margie Klein Ronkin, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with people that I've looked up to for a long time. So when I was thinking about this panel, or why I was asked to be on the panel, I think that there are lots of different categorizations how you could break down prayer and social justice, but I think one is that some prayer and social justice happens in Jewish contexts where we're organizing Jews or we're working in synagogues. And then there's other prayer and social justice that's sort of happening more in social justice contexts. And I think I maybe like the token, I'm more working in this. So I have a congregation, but then I spend all week working for doing congregation-based community organizing with PICO, which is the organization that Shawn spoke of, Power in Philadelphia. So, and I think as far as I know, I'm the only rabbi in any of the 4 organizing networks that is actually on staff. So it's brought an interesting kind of angle on how to think about Jewish prayer in the context of wider social justice movements. So if you think about prayer, one side of prayer as sort of, I think your categories are better than mine, but one side of prayer as sort of moving people towards social justice, or taking people from a place where they care to a place where they act. Then there might be another side, which is people who are doing social justice, figuring out what kind of prayer do we need, or what might prayer mean to us. And then the third category I thought of is ritual and liturgy that's created as part of social justice action. So I want to talk about the second two, as in prayer for social justice-y people and liturgy in social justice. One thing that you made me think of, Rolly, is this year around Passover, some of my 7th graders said we were reading the Passover story, and we were talking about the first Seder, and one of the 7th graders said, Rabbi, the first Seder seems to be happening in Egypt. It doesn't, we always thought it happened when the Israelites got freed. So what is going on that, they're having a Seder when they're not free? All they've done is put the blood on the lintel, and then they're celebrating as if they're free. And this got me thinking about what the Seder is about, or what are we, when we say in every generation we're supposed to feel as if we went forth from Egypt, I started thinking that maybe what the Seder is about is getting to that point where you feel like tomorrow I'm going to leave Egypt. And when I think about that, I think about the kind of courage that we need to, mark the blood on the lintel, whatever that means today, and to be ready to take that kind of step individually and collectively. And to me, that kind of question of how do we go from not moving, from being slaves, to taking the action that is required to get free, that's fundamentally a question of faith. It's a question of courage. It's a question of how to go from the world that you know to something that you believe could be better, but you really don't understand, or I think it's really hard to imagine how that would be possible. So that relates to, I want to share 2 stories. One is about how I think for me and for a lot of the people that I work with, prayer often bridges the breach between hopelessness and hope. So this past year, my organization successfully passed the highest minimum wage in the country, and also we passed earned sick time for 1 million Massachusetts workers, which was really awesome. But before that, okay, let's give a round of applause. Okay, so afterward, it all seemed like a done deal, and of course we won, and of course all the steps that we took made sense. But while I was working on it, I spent a lot of time with our leaders, who are primarily poor people of color, going door to door and hearing these terrible stories. I heard this one guy who he got a call from his sister saying their mother was dying in the hospital, and he told his boss, I need to go, I'll be back in a few hours, but I need to say goodbye to my mom. And his boss said, you can go, but don't think you can come back. 2 days later, I heard the story of this woman at the door who said her husband lost his job because he went to go be with her when she was in labor. And I felt just so personal. It was so personal hearing these stories and then talking to our leaders, and they kept saying to me, I can't go door to door because I'm afraid of being arrested. Because when they look at me, and they're talking, they're black and brown people primarily, they see someone dangerous, and so I'm afraid to go door to door. So I had these 2 sides. I had this desperate need on the one side, and hearing these stories and feeling so drawn and responsible. And on the other hand, I have no context. I'm privileged. I feel comfortable going door to door. No one's ever called the police on me. And I just started feeling completely overwhelmed. And I didn't just feel overwhelmed like, oh, my job is really hard. I felt like no matter how hard I work, these people's lives are still going to be hard. And even if we win our campaign, there's just nothing we can do in the immediate future that's going to transform everything that's hard about their lives. And I felt stuck. I felt like, a lot of the Baptists and evangelical preachers that I work with just said, oh, God has a plan. God's going to intervene. Don't worry. And I felt kind of stuck because my theology doesn't really say that God is going to come and intervene in history. And I felt like there was nowhere I could go except for to prayer. And so I turned to prayer, and I encouraged my leaders to do the same. And what I basically said was I just cried out to God. And I said, God, I don't know how to do this, but I ask for your strength, and I ask for the capacity to be really loving and patient. And And I feel like I want to be able to do everything, and I know I can't, but I know that with your help, maybe I can try my best. And after praying, I felt a lot better. And some people, I think some people I work with would say, oh, that was Jesus answering your prayer and telling you what you're supposed to do. I think for me, I more imagine God as the interconnectedness of everything in the universe, and that there's part of the divine in all of us. And so I kind of think when I was praying, what I was doing was kind of activating the holy part in myself that has the capacity to do this work. And that piece of me, hearing my deepest prayer, was able to reorient myself towards the work that I needed to do. And so I got away from my ego, which says, kind of like what you were saying, can I do everything? Am I in control? Can I force all my leaders to do what they need to do, which is a terrible way of organizing, by the way. And instead, I just kind of felt this humility and spiritual smallness, that I can only do what I can do, and that God will be with me when I try my best. And in that stance, I was much more able to be with the people that I was working with. And I felt like we were all able to be more present once we had that sense of outcry. And I would say that in some ways that's kind of like what you were talking about when you said prayer for comfort. But to me, it's a little bit different than that, because it was about how do we get the faith that we need to do the work that we need to do. And for me, I feel like the greatest barrier often to being able to do social justice work is not technical skills, it's not having a great strategy, it's really believing that you can do it in a world where everyone is telling you that you can't. And so prayer as a means of convincing us that God is bigger than our own imagination and our own doubt. The second piece I want to talk briefly about is ritual that grounds social justice work in faith. So I'm just learning about this, but with my Christian colleagues, I've been experimenting with the power of liturgical ritual to dramatize and deepen our work. So as one example, just a few months ago, when the non-indictments happened in Ferguson and Staten Island, a number of the ministers that I worked with came to me and said, we need to do something. What are we going to do? And as we started talking, we felt like it actually wasn't appropriate when people were in so much pain to do something right away. Like, we needed some time for lament. We needed some time to just feel the pain and experience it before we could even figure out what we were supposed to do. So we organized this interfaith evening of lament that happened a week before Christmas and during Hanukkah, which is a really hard time to organize anything involving priests and ministers because they're really busy. But we organized this event, and people shared their stories. We had people in small groups sharing their own experiences with the police and with mass incarceration. And then we did a ritual where we read the line, "A voice is heard in Ramah, Rachel is weeping for her children, for they are no more," which is from Jeremiah. And so we had this African-American young woman reading that. And then we had cards where it was sort of like a script, and all around this room that crossed all kinds of boundaries that normally divide us: race, class, faith, gender, sexuality. All these different people were reading these cards that said, like, "A voice is heard in Ferguson," and then someone else would say, Michael Brown's mother is weeping for her son. And then someone would say, "A voice is heard in Staten Island." And then someone else would say, Eric Garner's family is weeping for their father. And so we just went through like 20 different police killings with all these voices all around the room echoing the pain. And it was really powerful. And then from that, we went and lit Advent candles and then Hanukkah candles and talked about what it means to go from the pain that we feel to, we ask God to guide us towards the capacity to respond in the way that God wanted. And we didn't tell people what they were supposed to do coming out of that. We just said, this is happening. If you're interested, sign a card. We'll get back to you afterwards. But the power of prayer to and ritual to be present with people and to connect us with ancient pain and ancient lamentation, and to make us feel like our current pain and suffering was grounded in something sacred and holy and ongoing. I think it gave people strength to really feel what they needed to feel enough that they were then able to take action. And so since that event, hundreds of people have gotten involved, and in the main city where we work, Lynn, Massachusetts, the Black community has gotten involved in ways that they just never have before. And I think that part of it is that our ritual wound up spreading through the churches, and all kinds of people, through the space of prayer and lament, felt safe enough to actually feel their pain and then get angry about it. And from that point of anger, they were ready to act. And so I think that as we think creatively about what are the ways to integrate prayer and social justice, I want us to just keep thinking about how to connect our ancient tradition, our ancient rituals with our current pain in ways that help us experience God as with us in our journey towards justice and healing.
Thank you. We only, unfortunately, only have 5 minutes left in this session because we've been blessed with 4 very rich presentations. So what I'm going to do is basically the questions that we've received really kind of fall in, I think, into 2 broad categories. I'll throw out both questions, and if anybody finds any of these questions resonates with them, we'll use the remaining couple of minutes to look at them. So the first is, in all of your work, as you work towards social justice causes, I'm sure you've met many people who don't have faith in God. How would you define, if there is, what the value added, as it were, of faith is in social justice work? And the second is, many, many people pray in synagogues, pray full liturgies, but are not moved to do social justice. And most of us don't land up praying in the kind of powerful context that you were talking about, Jill. So, and we've heard that we shouldn't interrupt the flow of prayer, and we're told that there aren't too many words, perhaps, and we don't want to start slicing the words apart. So how, in practice, can we make sure that the prayers that people are reciting lead them in the directions that we're hoping that they will go? So 2 gigantic questions, but if anybody here has one of them that really resonates.
I'll attempt an answer to the second question. I think that if we find ourselves in a context of prayer that does not lead to any type of action, and I'm not just talking about social justice, but I'm talking about a sense of greater connection among people, certainly greater connection between people and our Creator, among people themselves, a greater sense of openness, a change, a transformation, opening of the mind and opening of the heart, a sense of greater love, greater concern, greater hospitality, greater disappointment with the world, and being fueled up to do something about it, I think our prayer doesn't work. So we have to examine, therefore, what's this prayer service about? What's our community about? I think we need to examine that. Now, it's possible to contextualize the prayer, to explain it, to open up some of these issues as we pray with kavanot, but I think it's very important to contextualize it also in our educational programs, classes, in order to be able for people to understand in our community, in writing, whichever way is available, for people to be able to understand what is the goal of our prayer as a community. And if we don't indicate that, if we don't direct our communities, we don't, put that as a goal, I think we are failing in a major way. So I think we have to make everything possible in order to orient our prayer service to all these things. It's prayer is not if prayer ends up being a sort of an exercise that is closed within itself, it has failed.
I agree with everything that Rolly said, and obviously you do that so beautifully at BJ. That's an example. I agree that we need to just be explicit about what place prayer holds in our community. That doesn't mean before every single prayer getting up and saying, well, this is about da 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 da, because that does break up the flow, but being explicit in other educational contexts in Divrei Torah about where prayer fits in. And as I mentioned, maybe even finding those places in the liturgy that we can lift up. This is something that Trua is actually working on now, to develop settings for liturgy that maybe we don't normally sing, but that bring out some of these justice themes. And in terms of value added, Margie spoke about this in your work, and I think really beautifully. For me, it's very much about the vision that Judaism gives, that the world can be perfected, the prophetic vision of what the world will look like in some future time. And a lot of times in the work of social justice, it feels like, okay, we passed this one law, but then 2 really bad laws got passed at the same moment. So it's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And for me, having that sense of we're ultimately heading towards somewhere and we're players in this bigger story keeps me waking up in the morning, keeps me doing the work, because otherwise I would feel like, forget it, it's not worth it. I'll go do something else where I don't even try.
And continuing the run-on sentence between us, then and to add that question of faith, because that's an easy one that we conduct too. That one doesn't need to use theistic language to be longing for something and longing for a world and to desire to have faith and fulfillment that way. So I would never want us to get trapped by certain language of prayer and thinking, even amongst rabbis, I remember my graduating class got tripped up. I suggested, what if we each offered each other a blessing and invited our families at our ordination? No, my family would freak out. We don't use the language of blessings. Or what if we changed that to inviting people to say one nice thing you wish for each other? Okay, that I can handle. Suddenly we did the same exercise, but we reshaped the language that suddenly everyone felt a little bit more comfortable with. So we need to be flexidologists around prayer and social justice, and also tolerant. Because true diversity means, at least I'm experiencing it now, that I allow other people to express their faith while being sensitive. So was a period of time where, we're going to have this interfaith piece, or this faith and secular or other organizations, so don't mention God, don't mention Jesus, and whatever it may be. And now I feel it's like, if you want Jesus to be present with you and that's going to move you forward, bring him in. I have a nice relationship with him myself, and I enjoy having a cup of tea every now and then. So, so it's not like you can't do that. So whether it's bringing in the sense of the values I hold, like Caplan would say, if the Melech HaOlam is too hard for you, you don't have a king, what are the ultimate sense of values that you hold your life? And on Yom Kippur, pass yourself in front of those values. Are you writing them into your life or not? So I think we can move in that direction. And then to build on some of the things you both said, weaving other aspects into our prayer experience. So we have a young man just had his bar mitzvah. Shout out to you, Noah, who spoke truth to power and has been at Harrisburg talking about the need for Pennsylvania to have fair, full funding for our schools. And so instead of me talking about that, which is one of our PICO organizing initiatives, Noah spent 5 minutes on Rosh Hashanah talking about that. So bringing those voices into our prayer service of people who are doing this work who normally wouldn't necessarily be highlighted in a prayer service, for me has been really important. We want to give you an aliyah for your work, teachers, activists, whatever it may be, and they may not always come to shul, and suddenly they have a venue to be lifted up. And Noah got a standing ovation. He said, you remember, I spoke for a half an hour. No one applauded. You spoke for 5 minutes, got a standing ovation. Remember this day. And that message got driven home. And last thing I'll say is, as co-director with Rabbi Marcia Prager of the Davening Leaders Training Institute, Shir Yaakov is here. He's on faculty now, too. We work with 50 to 60 people in a 2-year process to train them as better leaders, shlichei tzibur, leaders of prayer and spiritual leaders. But that very first day we say, for all these prayers that we're going to work on, we're going to be watching you from day one at the cafeteria. How do you navigate getting your food? How do you treat the other staff? How do you live a prayerful life? Not just is your relationship to the prayers. And that's what our liturgy is about, how to create prayerful consciousness, not just how to daven these words. So I think that's a way that we can challenge our folks as well as weave in people so that their voices are heard in tefillah, not just the voices of the text.
Okay, I feel weird saying this up here with a panel of rabbis, but I think part of the question of how do you involve people that are not interested in social justice, or is your prayer effective? I don't actually think the main way to get people involved in social justice is to pray. Because I think that if you don't understand how you're related to the other people, the prayer is unlikely to move you. And so I think that relationships and hearing other people's stories is a much more powerful way of getting people to the point of caring. And then prayer is a way of transforming us to understand that experience as holy and to connect that with our sense of Jewish obligation. But I think for most of our communities that are not thinking, okay, something in Judaism says I'm supposed to do X, therefore I'm going to do it, that being in relationship with people who are in pain has to be the first way that we invite people in, and then prayer creates a space to understand what that means in holy language. I also think in terms of the question of what does this even mean for people who don't believe in God or relate to God? And I think that kind of like what Shawn said, I kind of like to think of it as backing up to what are the emotions or what are the experiences that we have when we pray, and how to help create that for people who don't have that same language. So, for example, that might mean, like, I have for years had Shabbat dinners where all different people come and share one moment that they're grateful for in their week. And over time, people have said to me, oh, I was thinking all week about what was the thing I was grateful for. So it kind of created this way that they thought all week. And I don't know if that's prayer, but it feels like a blessing to me. And so just thinking about what are the ways that what's each person's starting point to be able to long or beg or thank, and to help them find those ways to the extent that feels meaningful.
Well, thank you to everyone here, Rabbi Zevit, Jacobs, Matalon, and Klein. And as it's been mentioned, this session, as in all the sessions, will be archived and available at caplancenter.org. And I know that I'm very much looking forward to reviewing this session and reflecting on wonderful things and interesting things that were said here. So thank you, and thank you.
Thank you to Eric and the terrific panel. So we've saved some of the best for last intentionally. As somebody just said, you now have to choose between Beit Halachmis, among other things. We have upstairs on 4 in the, I think it's called the President's Room. Upstairs on 4. We'll leave it at that, in the Rabbi's room. We have Dr. Dina Newberg and Rabbi Ofer Shabbat Beit Halachmi. The workshop session is called Shira U'Tefillah, Contemporary Israeli Voices in Liturgy. That should be great. Downstairs on the main floor, the first floor in the boardroom is Aharon Varadi, who's done this really interesting Open Sea Door project that many of you have seen online. He'll be talking about that and related issues. Right here, I'm going to call up Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, who is going to moderate our panel on theology and prayer. Jason.